Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexander von Rosenbach, and I'm the interim director here at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism in The Hague. I am just looking at the time and watching our participant count climb here, which is good. So I'll just make a short introduction to today's event while we let folks file into the room, and then I'll hand over the floor to Professor Schmid and the speakers today to hear about the important work that we're presenting for you. This is for those who have been on various webinars related to the handbook before, is the fourth in a series of webinars that we're doing focused on the Handbook of Prevention and Preparedness, focusing in this instance on the prevention of and preparedness for terrorist attacks. And what we're trying to do with these webinars is to bring the content that has been written and thought about for, in many cases, years, lifetimes of professional experience to life here, to bring the authors into the spotlight, to give them a chance to talk about their work, and also importantly, to give you on the other side of the digital divide here, an opportunity to ask questions directly of folks who have really spent, indeed mostly, a lifetime thinking about the challenges that we face in these different thematic areas. Today, is I think quite an interesting chapter. We've noticed quite a lot of really practitioner-oriented audiences today, which is a little bit different than our normal audiences for the handbook that we've seen over the last few webinars. I think that really speaks to the topic, which is very much practitioner-oriented, quite tactical in some ways, and I think very, very critical for the work that we all do in the field of national security and counterterrorism. So I'm really excited to hear more about each of these different thematic areas over the course of today. I will briefly give an introduction to ICCT for those who are less familiar with our work, and then, as I said, hand over to Professor Schmid. So ICCT, for those who don't know us, is a think tank focused on counterterrorism with a special focus on human rights and the rule of law. And we were founded 10 years ago with really this overarching or fundamental belief that counterterrorism is most effective when it is guided by human rights and the rule of law. And we really take pride in providing a platform for academic debate, but also for implementation of that in policy advice and in the field. So we work at the global level with the UN, with the European Commission to help shape counterterrorism practice and policy. We work at the national level to really try to get that policy embedded and stood up in a way that can be both effective and respectful of those core principles. We do that across a range of topics on foreign terrorist fighters, on prisons and exit work, on strategic communications, on a number of different legal and criminal justice responses to terrorism. So quite a wide range of work here. And importantly, I think it's also worth noting that we do work in the field hands-on with those who are more or less on the front lines. So we work in prisons in Mali, we work in the Western Balkans, we have worked in Southeast Asia, and there I think is where you also get a chance to make a different kind of impact than what you might make at the table in Brussels. And ICCT is, I think, privileged, but also through the product of hard work and quite a range of really smart and thoughtful folks able to bridge that gap between the policy, the academic, and the practitioner side of things. And how the handbook fits into to that world is really, I think, we hope, and I think Professor Schmid hopes as well, that the handbook really serves as a beacon for this field for some time. Obviously, Professor Schmid's first handbook on terrorism has proven to be quite a seminal work for the field, and we are really excited at ICCT to host this handbook on prevention and preparedness, which we think will also really serve as a bedrock document for a range of different folks for indeed years or decades to come. So a short note on logistics. Today is, I guess, part one of part 4, as it would be. This is quite a broad chapter in whole, or a broad section as a whole. So we've divided it up into 2 webinars. One today, you'll hear from 6 authors on a range of topics, and we'll have another webinar next Tuesday, so exactly 1 week from today, same time, to pick up the back half of this grouping of authors. So please, if you like what you hear today, I know many of you have indicated as well that you would like to attend next week's session, so we'll look forward to seeing you there. But please, if you also find this interesting, feel free to invite some more colleagues along for next week's session as well. Importantly, for anyone who has missed this session or you're only able to join for part of it, we will, of course, host this on our website and on ICCT's YouTube channel, so you can come back to it. The publication itself is available as a sort of whole body of work on ICCT's website, and we are producing chapters and releasing them 1 week at a time, or one chapter per week. We are reaching the conclusion. We're in the final phases there of getting all the chapters live. But that is basically just to say that there's quite a wealth of resources beyond what you'll hear today on a number of different topics. So please do go take a look and see if there's anything else that is useful for you in your lines of work. I will make just a brief introduction to Professor Schmid. I hope his name resonates with many of you. As I said, he is really a giant in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism. He's a longtime friend and research fellow at ICCT, has something like 200 plus publications to his name, has done an incredible amount of work to advance the academic debate, and also really worked in the field with and alongside to I guess make an impact in that way as well. So we're really privileged to have him and the community of experts that he's brought together here with us today to share some insights. Professor Schmid, I think that's all you need to hear from me. I'd love to hand you the mic. And maybe pop your microphone on so we can hear you.
Good afternoon, everybody in Europe. Good evening in Asia, and good morning in the States. I see that we have more than 120 participants to this introduction of this first part of part 4. Unfortunately, one of the authors cannot be with us, but I'm glad that we have all the others. Let me just introduce you to them all. The one who cannot be with us is Ken Duncan, who used to be chairman of the Interagency Intelligence Committee on Terrorism in the United States, appointed in September 2001, before he served in a similar function, coordinating information and intelligence in the State Department. I had the privilege to be interacting with him when I was in St. Andrews, where he retired, and almost every Wednesday he dropped into my office and explained to me the world through behind the veil. So I will summarize his chapter briefly, but before I do so, let me just introduce the other participants, contributors to the handbook. One is Professor Joshua Sinai. He's professor of practice in counterterrorism at the Capital Technology University in Laurel, Maryland. He is also the book reviews editor of Perspectives on Terrorism and author of books like Active Shooter, a handbook on prevention. Then I see Annelies Pauwels, who is a polyglot from Belgium. She's a research fellow at the Flemish Peace Institute in Brussels, but worked before that in UNICRI and UNODC, and is a specialist on migration issues, terrorism, and organized crime as well. Then we have Rachel Monaghan, who is a professor at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University in the UK. She is also a co-editor of the journal Behavioral Sciences of Terrorism and Political Aggression, and president of the Society for Terrorism Research. Her chapter is co-edited by David McElhatton, but he cannot be with us today. Then we have finally Susan Martin. She is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the International Affairs Program at the University in Nevada, where she has worked with Lady Weinberg and written books like The Role of Terrorism in 21st Century Warfare. We will present the different chapters one after the other. And since Ken Duncan cannot be with me, he sent me his PowerPoints, and I would like to ask Charlie to put them up. It's a very dense chapter in which Ken Duncan summarizes his decades-long experience in foreign affairs and in the intelligence community. And it's very much a US perspective, where he describes the development of intelligence in the field of counterterrorism. And one of the quotes he sent me to go with this particular PowerPoint is, "With good intelligence, a campaign against terrorism will be long and difficult. Without intelligence, it will be lost." Then can I have the second PowerPoint that he sends me, where he tries to explain in this chapter, and you should read it because it is a masterly chapter condensing the wisdom he accumulated. And one of the things that he says, if it's a fact, it ain't intelligence, quoting former CIA Director Michael Hayden. So we are dealing with probabilities in this area. The chapter itself is termed Early Warning or subtitled Early Response, a subtitle that comes from my experience in the Forum on Early Warning and Early Response that was set up after the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. And since genocide and terrorism are both involved in one-sided killings, one can inform also the other. The chapter of Ken Duncan describes the nature and benefits derived from an intelligence-driven counterterrorism strategy. It also relates how the US created the organizations necessary for the production of intelligence. When he was at the helm of that pyramid, there were 16 intelligence agencies in the US government. I think there's one more since 2001. In the chapter, he tries to show us the role of warnings in intelligence for disruption, for preemption, for mitigation, and recovery. Public warnings are important for promoting threat awareness, but have the drawback that if you raise the threat levels too much without the public understanding the meaning, it gets accustomed to it and might not react accordingly. In the next slide, he gives us some guidelines for warning and shows that the role of information is often difficult for an agency like the FBI, who want to bring people to trial, and intelligence agencies who don't need that conclusive evidence for their work. And this friction between the agencies, FBI and CIA in this particular case, have been difficult and have been one of the reasons why the warning for the 9/11 attacks, and there were almost 24 warning signs up there, did not lead to a prevention of that particular event that has shaped the last 2 decades so strongly. In the next slide, he summarizes some of the key developments in the United States counterterrorism work, dealing in his chapter with a threat analysis group, which was established in 1976, and it shows the evolution of these units. One of the developments that he sketches in his chapter is the great degree to which after 9/11, cooperation in counterterrorism between intelligence agencies across borders evolved, sometimes even when they were in the political and military field opponents or adversaries, but when it came to counterterrorism, they have nevertheless worked together. He also describes in his chapter the evolution of Homeland Security Council that developed to the Department of Homeland Security, which I believe is now the biggest agency in Washington. He then goes in the next slide, called Seeing Terrorism in Perspective, into the proliferation of analysis center, fusion center that we see in the world. I have seen that myself in the UN when I came to the fresh terrorism prevention branch. I was the only unit in the UN, except the Office of Legal Affairs of Hans Corell in New York, that dealt with terrorism. And now, on latest count, I think there are some 40 of them in the UN alone. But the proliferation of units, each with its speciality, has also drawbacks, which he describes in his chapter, Building on Lessons Learned from the 9/11 Commission report. One of the bottlenecks, for instance, is there are only so many language analysts for certain languages, and the amount of documents that need to be translated in actionable time is very large. There has been in recent years, but that is another part of his chapter, a shift to lone wolf for single actor attacks, self-radicalized young people, which puts the weight of intelligence collection again back to law enforcement, since it's often a matter of homegrown domestic terrorism, though inspired by international conflicts. So in this chapter, we get a very rich overview of what intelligence can and cannot do when it comes to counterterrorism. One of the problems is that when intelligence is unwanted, the consumer, which in his case was the Secretary of State in the State Department and later the US President, might not always be willing to accept certain intelligence. There are facts, there are unwanted facts, and that same goes for intelligence. I really recommend you to look at this chapter, which for me is one of the most fascinating ones in the whole handbook. Now we come to the next chapter, which Joshua Sinai will introduce, and I understand that a colleague of his who prepared a slide for his chapter will join him. Joshua, I give the word to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's a real privilege to contribute to this important handbook. And one of the reasons I was especially interested in writing the chapter on lone actors in America is that, as you know, terrorism isn't about abstractions, but about real people who engage in terrorist attacks. So to understand the phenomenon of lone actors in America, why not look at actual cases and then try to generate empirically based findings about many of their characteristics. So in this chapter, we examine the threats in terms of attacks and plots posed by 52 ideologically extremist lone actor domestic terrorists in the US during the almost 50-year period from the early 1970s to November 2019. The chapter's appendix provides capsule overviews of the 52 cases. And what isn't included in the chapter is an Excel spreadsheet that we use to enter data about the 52 cases. And this will be explained later on by my associate, Jeff Fuller, who operationalized the database and provided a lot of guidance in writing the chapter. And the term lone actor is used as opposed to lone wolf. It's a preferred term for me because wolves are intelligent and crafty animals, as opposed to lone actors who have trouble getting along with other people, including groups who often reject them. So they act alone, although they generally have some connections with other extremists in online forums. And domestic terrorism refers to individuals who attack other Americans for political objectives, reside in the US at the time of their attack, whether citizens or on visitors' visas. You have to be a little flexible in coding them, and have minimal contacts with foreign terrorist groups. Their ideologies are either domestic, such as white supremacists, anti-abortion, etc., or foreign, such as global jihadism. And by coincidence, around November 2019, when we were finishing putting together the listing of cases, the FBI came out with a report on lone offenders, a study of lone offender terrorism in the US, covering pretty much the same period, except they end theirs at 2015. But one difference between our approaches is that the FBI does not provide any specific information about their 52 cases, and not even their incidents. And also, so I have no way of knowing if our 52 cases match theirs. But because their study is still empirically interesting and there's a lot of inductively based statistical findings that are useful, I use some of them in the study. So so just to give you a very brief overview of the empirical component of the database, we looked at, I entered information about the dates of incidents, names of perpetrators, age, marital status, type of event, attack or plot, ideologies, psychological disposition, weapons used, selection of targets and target types, how incidents ended, and did the attackers stay at the scene or escape. And now Jeff Fuller will be able to explain the nature of the Excel spreadsheet and how it was operationalized.
Thank you, Joshua. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, this on the right side of this slide, you can see a snapshot of the database. Please click the slide again. It's a build slide. Across the top, you can see the, and I don't intend to go into these in detail, but just give you an impression, the data fields that we ended up using. Next click, please. It was not surprising, but interesting that the data fields that we ended up using evolved over time. As Joshua went through the analysis, he or I would recognize, hey, there's something, there's another attribute here that we should consider. So there was a number of cases where we'd add an attribute and have to go back and reanalyze the different sources that we had in order to build a database. So you can see here just a couple representations of the data, of many, just to give you an impression. I'm a big believer in a picture's worth 1,000 words, and maybe a graph is worth a couple thousand. So you can see, and Joshua talks to this in more detail in his the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. So those are just a couple representations of the data. I found it a very interesting project. It was interesting to see how these different factors evolved and came into play and ended up being characterizing the events that Joshua analyzed. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so in terms of some of our findings, in terms of incident trends, we found an escalation in the number of plots and attacks over the years, especially since the early 2000s. Of the 52 incidents, 38 took place between 2010 and 2019, 30 attacks and 8 plots. Most were single attacks in one day as opposed to over several years or several weeks. For example, Ted Kaczynski, Eric Rudolph, the Washington Beltway snipers who took about a month to carry out their attacks. Prevalence of one-person lone actor attacks over two-person attacks where they acted as lone actors. One of the interesting things about investigating this in an empirical way is that you come up with a lot of insights that then can contribute to reformulating definitions. So as a result of this, I'm now in a position to start reframing what it means to be a lone actor terrorist. And we found another finding is that the prevalence of one-person lone actor attacks over a two-person attackers, such as Timothy McVeigh, the Beltway snipers, the Tsarnaev brothers who carry out the Boston Marathon bombing, the husband and wife who carried out the attacks in San Bernardino, and an overwhelming presence of males among the attackers, with only one female participating in an attack with her husband in San Bernardino. But after we finished populating the database in December 2019, a boyfriend and girlfriend carried out a mass shooting in Jersey City, where they killed a policeman and then they killed 3 people in a Jewish market. So that was not entered into our database. Another finding, and this is on the next slide, is that in terms of weapons, more than 50% employed firearms, with 5 using 2 weapons, such as firearms and knives or firearms and explosives. And in terms of psychological drivers, lone actors do not fit into organized groups. I mean, this is widely known. They have difficulty getting along with other members. Some had a history of engaging in domestic violence, such as Omar Mateen. Joan Smith has written a very interesting book about terrorists who have engaged in domestic violence, which is one of the interesting psychological characteristics, typifying many of them. And also some share similar disorders as the psychologically driven active shooters. So in looking at lone actors and terrorists, you should be aware that they share many characteristics with those who engage in active shooting events and also in workplace violence. Next slide. And in terms of preventive measures, it's important to expand the counterterrorism focus to look at groups and lone actors. And it's crucial to identify pre-incident suspicious behaviors and mindsets for early warning observables, what's known as the trajectory pathway into terrorism, where you begin with the triggers and then violent ideation, where they think about taking revenge, and then they cross over the threshold into violence and engage in planning and preparation activities such as acquiring weapons. And many of these early warning indicators can be observed online, where many of them leak their attack intentions. And early preemption is crucial, including using undercover informers to collect evidence for indictment, but under court approval. And with many lone actors having previous criminal records, including incarceration, it's important to closely monitor their post-incarceration activities and associations. I know this has been a huge problem in England. And in terms of future trends, I believe that the fifth historical wave of terrorism, this is David Rappaport's notion of the four historical waves of terrorism, where we have now introduced a fifth wave, which I believe began around 2019 and this year. We see how violent street demonstrations by extremists on all sides are being mobilized and tolerated by certain political leaders. And the January 21 insurrectionist takeover of the US Capitol building was a game changer, because for the first time, groups and lone actors joined forces in the attacks. And also in terms of counterterrorism, the FBI and others are using new technologies to identify and arrest alleged terrorists, such as facial recognition and geospatial tracking technologies. So I look forward to the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for this summary. Annelies Powells has written on a similar subject, focusing also on knife-based attacks, low-tech attacks. And we turn now to Annelies Powells. Antoinette or Charlie, can you switch the camera for that purpose?
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you. Hello.
Okay, that's a good start already. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So hello everybody, I am Annelies Powells. I'm a researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute, which is an independent research institute in Belgium affiliated to the Flemish Parliament. And in my contribution to the handbook, I looked at the type of weapons that are most commonly used by lone actors in Western Europe. And I did so by conducting an analysis on the evolution of the use of weapons over the last 20 years in Western Europe, based on the data from the Global Terrorism Database from the University of Maryland. In my presentation, I'll share three conclusions of this research. First conclusion is a bit more general on lone actors in more general. If I can have the previous slide still. Yes, thank you. And the first conclusion is that lone actor terrorism is rising. So with lone actor, I mean the terrorists that plan, prepare, and commit their attacks without direction from a wider organization. And on the graph, you can see that there's a clear rise in attacks by lone terrorists in Western Europe. So over the last 20 years, it's from 1999 to 2018. And you see a clear rise, especially starting from 2011. The rise becomes more stark in 2014, with a clear peak in 2017. The numbers after that, I checked again, have been going down again until reaching again level of 2014, 2015. So still quite high levels. So I think this is quite in line with a more general rise in terrorism, or also group-based terrorist activities, but the proportion of the rise of lone actor terrorism is still quite higher than the rise in group-based actors. In the graph also, I highlighted the different types of weapons that are most commonly used by lone actors in Europe, and the ones that I analyzed in my chapter. So explosives, firearms, arson, and knives. On the graph, I also included vehicle-based attacks, which I did not analyze in my chapter, as I think that another author is analyzing this specific tool in a different chapter. Thank you for the next slide. So a second conclusion of my research is that not all lone actor attacks are high profile attacks, and not all of them lead to high numbers of fatalities. And one of the main reasons for the disparity in between lone actor attacks is the type of weapon used. On the graph, we can see that firearms are the most deadly type of weapon when they are in the hands of lone actors, followed by vehicles. So vehicles, we see that there have been in Europe lately some very highly lethal attacks, such as the attack in Nice in 2016, which caused a high number of casualties. Knives and arson, on the contrary, cause a very lower rate of lethality when used by lone actors. Can I have the next slide, please? Third conclusion is more related to weapon use. When analyzing weapons used by lone actors, we can see clear evolution in starting around the year 2014. One of the sub conclusions with regards to weapon use is that there's a clear decrease in the proportion of gun-related attacks since 2011. However, we see that those lone actors that use firearms in their attacks still cause the highest lethality. Again, with exception of vehicle-borne attacks, as I mentioned before, that some of which have been very, very lethal. Yet again, also when we look at vehicle-borne attacks, we see that some of them have been facilitated by the use of a firearm. In particular, the attack that I mentioned before in Nice in 2016, but also a vehicle-borne attack in Berlin at the Christmas market at the same year. They both were, in both attacks, we see that the firearm was used as a tool in order to gain control over the truck that was then used in the attack, which caused more casualties. We see also, when we talk about gun-related attacks, we also see that those lone actors that do employ firearms, they more increasingly they make use of automatic or semi-automatic rifles. Almost a third of gun-related violence by lone actors in the last decade has been committed with this type of weapons. With regards to knives, we see that lone actors might have exchanged the use of firearms for more readily available weapons, like, for instance, knives. There is a stark increase in knife-based attacks. Since 2014, this has become one of the two primary weapons of choice for lone actors, which is a position that is shared with arson or incendiary devices. Interesting in this aspect is that lone actors do not only make use of small kitchen knives or medium kitchen knives, as often is the perception, but there is also a quite large number of attacks that is actually perpetrated with large bladed weapons, like, for instance, a sword or an axe or a machete. We also see that there is a decrease in the proportion of explosives-based attacks by lone actors. Here, an interesting conclusion is that attacks with explosives by lone actors often fail, and they also cause a low level of lethality. And this is a very strong contrast with similar attacks that are perpetrated by group-based attackers. In my analysis, I found out that only 1 in 10 of the bomb-based attacks by lone actors in Europe over the last 20 years actually killed an individual other than the attacker him or himself. With regards to arson, this is also has become also a primary weapon of choice for lone actors. In particular, after 2014. So I calculated between 2014 and 2017, there have been more than 8 times as many arson attacks as in the previous 16 years combined. So the increase of the use of arson is really quite massive. Targets here varied from banks to private residences, but also more and more these type of attacks are targeted at refugee-related buildings or places of worship. Arson attacks by lone actors are less deadly, significantly less deadly than assaults with other weapons, but it's also important to notice that fire is also a strong tactical weapon, in particular because it carries a high fear factor on victims, on communities that are targeted with this type of attacks. But also fire is a perfect tool to draw a lot of media attention, which is what terrorists often want. What are possible countermeasures? I think it's fair to say that 100% safety from lone actor attacks is something that is probably not achievable. However, there are some viable countermeasures against this type of attack. For instance, it's possible to limit possibilities for lone actors that they at least to cause high number of fatalities. Terrorists often use those weapons that are available. So one possible countermeasure is to curb access to those weapons that are most deadly in order to reduce the lethality of these attacks. Another important aspect is also that we see that a higher risk to cause lethality also comes from those individuals that have received training and have no knowledge or know-how on how to use the weapons that they use. So an important recommendation is also to continue introducing obstacles to gaining training on using weapons, both in real life as also on the internet. Legislation also plays a very important role in restricting access to weapons, the various types of weapons. But obviously this type of legislation often has to maintain a certain balance between, on the one hand, curbing access to weapons or materials to manufacture weapons for those with bad intentions, and on the other hand, obviously not trying to hinder the general population access to tools that are quite commonly used in everyday life, or not hinder the purchasing of this type of tools for commercial purposes. A clear example of this difficult balance that needs to be maintained are chemical precursors. So many of these chemical precursors for explosives, they're also used in commonly used household products like bleaching material and other types of everyday use material. We see also that legislation at the EU level exists, but there is still some gaps and loopholes regarding a lack of harmonization. So, for instance, with regards to the implementation, where it is possible between one member state and the other member state, which can lead to fewer restrictions or also lower level of control in one member state with regards to another member state. And it obviously creates loopholes that terrorists are quite eager to make use of. Last but not least, also, I wanted to highlight, if I can have the last slide, the previous slide still, please, that the phenomenon of lone actor violence is very complex and obviously also requires asks for more downstream preventive measures because it's such a complex phenomenon. Lone actors also often are dealing with complex needs. For instance, some research has focused on the presence of mental health issues among a certain number of lone actors. So that requires certain more downstream preventive measures, such as lowering the threshold of having access to mental health care. Reintegration of detainees, ex-detainees is also important, as we see that there is still a certain amount of lone actors that have a criminal antecedent. I will end my presentation here, but if I can have the last slide, please, I would just quickly wanted to draw attention to also, for those who want to know more about weapon use by terrorists in Europe, these are two reports, one book and a report by my colleagues at the Flemish Peace Institute, one on firearms acquisition by terrorists in Europe, and another about Armed to Kill, a comprehensive analysis of gun use in public mass shootings in Europe between 2009 and 2018. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Annelies, for summarizing your chapter. We are now turning to a chapter written by Rachel Monaghan and David McLennan, dealing with terrorist bombings, including improvised explosive devices. Rachel, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to thank ICCT for the opportunity to present our chapter, and also to Alex for putting together the handbook. I don't have any nice slides for you, so you've just got me, I'm afraid. So in the next 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about our chapter that David and myself wrote about the prevention of bomb attacks by terrorists in urban settings, with a focus on improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And it gave us the opportunity to marry some interests of ours. I've been a criminologist for far too long now, and David is an expert in the built environment. As such, then, our chapter is a synthesis of existing literature, and it draws on then a body of literature, much of which is informed by rational choice theory and also situational crime prevention. Rational choice theory attempts to explain human behavior and assumes when people, when faced with several options, will go with the one they expect to have the best outcome. So this theory was utilized by criminologists with respect then to decision making by criminals, and considers criminal behavior as outcomes and choices made by the offender. So situational crime prevention then attempts to reduce specific crimes by affecting the situational determinants, namely the immediate environment and opportunity reduction of that crime, and thereby making it less likely to occur. So situational crime prevention isn't concerned with why a crime occurs, but how it's committed. And it involves then a number of mechanisms by which to affect the potential offender's decision-making process, including increasing the effort, increasing the risk, and reducing the rewards. So Clark and Newman in their work identified 4 key pillars of situational opportunities that terrorists exploit in order to engage in terrorism, namely targets, weapons, tools, the everyday objects used to carry out their attacks, such as money and ID cards, and also the facilitating conditions. Those factors that permit attacks to incur, including access to buildings, a lack of identification requirements. So with these theoretical considerations behind situational crime prevention discussed, albeit briefly, and if you want a very good chapter on this, I point you to chapter 3 by Kelly Burkle of this handbook, who's done a really good job in discussing situational crime prevention. But with that basis outlined, the main focus then of the presentation is on what practical steps can be taken to prevent bomb attacks. And for this presentation, I'm only looking at target hardening. So target hardening is where you make it impossible to attack the targets, or to have an attack on a target judged not worthwhile by the terrorists, given the elevated risk, effort, or difficulty associated with a successful attack. Now, much of the protective security literature emphasizes a layered approach to security involving 4 independent layers: deter, prevent, protect, and contain, with each layer representing an integrated system of measures or controls designed to either stop a terrorist attack from occurring or to mitigate its consequences if it does. So deter and prevent are aimed at reducing the likelihood of a terrorist attack, while protect and contain are intended to reduce the attack's impact. So the majority of bombs are placed bombs, that is to say person-borne IEDs and vehicle-borne IEDs, including that of suicide bombers. And as Atlas and DeGorio note in their work, that because the majority of bombs are placed, controlling access is the most important thing that facility managers can do to protect their facilities. So establishing a secure perimeter with access control procedures can guard against terrorists gaining access to a site while allowing authorized personnel entrance. Utilizing comprehensive screening procedures can prevent devices from entering a potential target space. For example, for a person IED, either a hand-carried device or a suicide bomber's vest. So screening stations at entrances, the requirement that visitors show ID to reception personnel for admittance to building can all be undertaken. For those devices involving vehicles, vehicle access is important, and this can include the separation then of access points by vehicle type, namely your employee or your service or visitors' vehicles. Underground parking and public parking close to the site must be secured or should be non-existent, while street parking adjacent to the potential target shouldn't be permitted. Additional measures can include controlling the flow of traffic around targets, can be also done through road closures, speed limits, traffic redirection, the use of high curbs, and also bollards. Vehicle-borne IEDs can involve moving cars or trucks as well as stationary vehicles. For both types, then increasing the separation distance between the vehicle and target standoff distance is crucial and is seen as the most effective defense against vehicle-borne IEDs. So physical barriers then are required to counter the threat. For a stationary vehicle bomb, the barrier need only make it difficult to cross the boundary without being noticed, whereas for a moving vehicle-borne IED, the barrier must be capable of stopping the vehicle, thereby providing a hard stop. Such security barriers can include passive mechanisms like static bollards, strengthened planters, walls, fences, or even topographical features like waters, bunds, and ditches, whereas active measures can involve retractable blockers, bollards, and gates. Measures designed to increase both the natural and mechanical surveillance opportunities can also reduce the probability of a bomb attack being successful, in that a placed bomb may become more visible. Natural opportunities include good lines of sight, the absence or removal of blind spots and hiding places, consideration of the placement of windows, and replacing litter bins with clear plastic bags. I grew up in London in the 1980s, and I didn't know what a litter bin was because they were mostly removed to stop the provisional IRA from planting bombs in them. Mechanical surveillance includes things like the installation of CCTV and automatic number plate recognition. Blast-resistant construction, once the domain of military facilities and critical infrastructure, is increasingly being considered for commercial developments and buildings. As already noted, standoff distance is considered the most effective measure against a terrorist bomb. However, if distancing is not present or can't be imposed, then other measures exist. So many blast-resistant measures are aimed at preventing progressive structural collapse by increasing the building's ductility and incorporating more columns and load-carrying walls. An example of where progressive structural collapse was evident following a terrorist attack was the Oklahoma City bombing. In existing structures and buildings, retrofit measures can be taken to prevent progressive structural collapse, including strengthening columns on lower floors. Facade protection can help to prevent or mitigate blast injuries and would include such things as laminated glass and blast-resistant curtain wall protection. Providing good evacuation routes, including good signage, safe refuge areas, and emergency lighting, has the potential to reduce the impact of bomb, and in doing so, reduce the terrorist benefits and rewards from undertaking the attack. For those terrorists not engaging in suicide attacks, a number of measures aimed at increasing the offender's cost of undertaking a bomb attack center around the risk of being apprehended by security and law enforcement. In the past, we have seen the creation of security zones around whole city sections, most notably in Baghdad, Belfast, London, New York, and Washington. In Belfast in the early 1970s, barbed wire and concrete barriers were placed at the entrances to the small shopping streets in the city centre. Over time, these were replaced with permanent and steel barriers. London enacted its own ring of steel in the City of London in 1992 and a mini ring in London Docklands in 1996, following bomb attacks by the Provisional IRA. In New York and Washington, in the aftermath of the Oklahoma bombing and 9/11, Jersey barriers, huge concrete blocks, sprung up around monuments. Such measures have been described in the literature as fortifying or militarizing urban space. While overt protective security measures are still evidence, there has been a shift towards more toned down security with invisible and sensitive measures. This shift emphasizes that security interventions should be acceptable to the public, aesthetically pleasing, and less obtrusive. An example of this would be the new American embassy opened in London, an 11-story glass cube which sits on a hill and is surrounded by a reflecting pool on a self-contained multi-level site, mainly planted with trees and grasses. Thank you for listening. I know I'm out of time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rachel, for that. Before we come to the questions, we have two more presentations, including one by myself. I wrote 6 chapters of the 35 in the handbook, including the one on prevention of kidnappings and hostage takings by terrorists. Most such acts are actually done by common criminals, but there is a gray zone between common criminality and financing of terrorism. Kidnappings and hostage takings are dual phase acts. There is the initial capture of a person against their will, and then there is the phase of protracted negotiations that can end in a release or have a tragic ending. The chapter is based mainly on 2 data sets from Iterate that deal with roughly 2,000 incidents each between 1970 and 2020. These data sets are overlapping, but they deal only with transnational incidents. So the dynamics for domestic terrorism might be different. Can I have their first slide, Charlie? Thank you. There are 2 basic situations. One where the location of the kidnapped persons, the hostages, is known. That would be in a barricade situation where the site, for instance, a foreign embassy that has been occupied, is soon surrounded by security forces, and a situation where the location is unknown or unreachable. These are the 2 main situations discussed in the literature, but there is in fact a large area of forced kidnappings, disappearances that have been done by states in the past and probably continue to this day. The main examples in literature are Argentina and other countries in the Cono Sur in Latin America. But we see also a type of kidnapping, as we saw with the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda or with Boko Haram in Nigeria, where young people are recruited forcefully or used as war brides. There are other types of kidnappings, some criminal, some political, some mixed, like the miracle fishing that we saw frequently in Colombia, roadblocks by fake military or policemen, where people are taken from a bus and the rich ones are kept and used for blackmail and extortion. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, when it comes to prevention, there are two phases where prevention is possible, though difficult. One is the prevention of being caught, and the second is the prevention of being killed, which comes after the phase. The first one is to a large extent in the hands of the potential victim or its protector itself, while the second hand is largely in the hands of the terrorists and the hostage negotiators and the deal they make. If you look at the literature on prevention of kidnappings, it refers mainly to diplomats, corporate managers in risk countries, expat members. So you get, for instance, these profiles which have been developed by the Bundeskriminalamt and distributed by Europol. All of these advices seem simple and logical, and also so vague at times, and also difficult to keep up because one developed routines. But cumulatively, they have some effect. But it is very difficult for potential victims to see that they are potential victims and then not to lose vigilance. And so the problem of not being caught is quite large. In fact, if we look at the success rate of criminal and terrorist kidnappers, it's quite high, though the statistics that we have are only partial, because kidnapping is one of those crimes that's neither in the interest of the government nor of the terrorists, nor of the families of the victims, that it is brought to publicity. And so of the 10,000s of kidnappings that take place in the world, most of them for criminal reasons only, we hear only of a few. But these here are some of the things you can do when you try to prevent being kidnapped. Can I have the next slide, please? The first moments, the first 90 minutes until the victim is brought to a safe house where they are kept are the most difficult ones, because there's nervousness, there's fear of a gun battle. The victim cannot do very much in this situation except trying not to have a mental breakdown. In the chapter, you find statistics about the length of typical kidnappings. They might go from a week or less to months and even years. So it means that one has to have a lot of resilience. There's a whole literature of people who survived kidnappings that can give you some advice. Can I have the next slide, please? Over the years, that's almost a half a century now, art, some even think it's a science of negotiating with terrorists has evolved. That experience has mainly been developed for either criminal kidnappings or for hostage barricade siege situations. And every government these days has teams of hostage negotiators that work usually with 5 or 6 on one case. There has also been a commercial industry evolved, paid by insurance companies who insure high probability targets against the danger of kidnapping. So here are some of the wisdoms developed. This particular statistics is based on 50 hostage negotiators and what they experience and where they agree. Can I have the next slide, please? However, we have in recent years seen different type of kidnappings by people who are willing to die with the hostages rather than submit to negotiations. And it's difficult to negotiate with such people. Nevertheless, I've talked to negotiators who have been involved in all sorts of negotiations, including people who had been disappeared by governments. And so certain knowledge has evolved among them how to deal with terrorists. The terrorists these days have usually a communication channel to their superiors, like the negotiators have a communication channel, a closed one, to the government to see what sort of concessions can be made, for instance, in terms of publicity or in terms of money. Of course, usually one says no money passed when hostages are released, but we have seen cases where hostages were released after hundreds of millions of dollars were paid, especially in the Middle East. But already in the 1970s, 50 millions were paid in one particular case. Paying for the release of hostages, of course, is a double-edged sword, because that money is likely in many cases to be reinvested in other kidnappings, so that a temporary solution saving some lives now might not bring end to hostage taking, but might rather encourage it, especially when it's highly publicized and when the hostage taking and the ransom are becoming part of public knowledge. When we think of terrorism, we usually think of bombings, shootings, attack, but hostage situations are more cruel in many ways than others. And sometimes, like the occupation of the US Embassy in Tehran in 1979, which lasted, I think, 444 days, can have huge impacts on the political situation. The same is true for Russia with the Beslan school attacks. It is something where people identify strongly with the victims, or a few identify with the terrorists. It has all sorts of repercussions, and is really one of the situations where polarization in societies and between countries can take place. Writing this chapter has for me been the most difficult one of all the chapters, because of reading the testimonies of victims, of their relatives, and seeing what it does also to the victims in the long run in terms of post-traumatic stress disorders. It just opens your eyes how horrible this all is. I've addressed a couple of things that can be done either by the victims themselves or by hostage negotiators. But the question is, what can be done upstream or midstream against such a crime? And there is very little that can be done. But one of the situations I looked into in this chapter is what happened in Chechnya in the second half of the 1990s, where you see the breakdown of rule of law, of good governance, where practically kidnapping became an occupation for large sectors of the population. It became almost an industry, and it just shows what preconditions exist that lead to mass industrial kidnappings almost. That situation also came after the US intervention in Iraq, where kidnappings were also for a while at the order of the day. So much can be done with an upstream that is not directly related to kidnapping, but will prevent kidnappings and hostage taking further down the line. So lessons can be learned from such worst case situations as we saw in Chechnya or Iraq. I leave it at that, but recommend you to have a look at this chapter. It makes for difficult reading, but hopefully will open some eyes to the dangers involved here. Yes, I pass on now the discussion to our last presentation on the prevention of suicide attacks by terrorists, and it is Susanne Martin in Nevada that will talk about this subject. Are you online, Susan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can see you, I can hear you, so
Perfect.
I focus on you.
Perfect. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a little bit early in the morning here, and I'm not really a morning person. I may not use all of my slides in the interest of time, as well as in the interest of the kind of order of discussion. Following so many presentations with such interesting and relevant information to which mine ties in and is still distinct. Thank you so much also for the opportunity to discuss one of these important topics. In this case, the topic of suicide attacks by terrorists. I should start by saying my work is typically on focusing on the tactics and strategies of non-state actors, so terrorist groups, insurgent groups, some political parties that have violent wings. So I tend to, in my work, look at why do the groups use the tactics they do? And when I approach the question that was originally posed to me, that is how I originally thought of how we might prevent suicide attacks. What would be the incentives? Are there any examples of cases in which suicide attacks have been prevented? And if in fact there are, which I have a couple of examples that seem to be illustrative, how was that accomplished? So this is the perspective I start my chapter with, or I start my discussion with. The focus, of course, is on preventing one type of attack. So again, I focus on tactics and strategies, and suicide attacks are one tool or tactic used by various non-state actors, including terrorist groups. So how is that one attack, a type of attack, possibly prevented? How can groups be deterred from using it, or how can they be prevented from using suicide attacks? I do approach this consistent with my research as a group level phenomenon. This is not primarily a lone actor type of attack. Individuals may want to carry out suicide attacks, but individuals alone typically, for the most part, with exceptions, don't have the capacity to do so, whether it be lacking the capacity to create the bomb that would be necessary to carry out an actual suicide attack. So I look at this as a group level phenomenon, something that groups orchestrate. Groups use suicide attacks as destructive and deadly tactics. Kind of like Annelies said, creating that strong fear. I believe that was in reference to fires, creating a strong fear. Well, certainly explosions do something quite similar. And with the suicide attacker as the guided weapon, or as some have referred to, the smart weapon, these can be very targeted attacks, and they can be aimed at relatively hard targets, including militaries and states, and they can be aimed at softer civilian targets in places where people expect to be safe. And in those ways, fear is really perpetuated by the use of suicide tactics. They're very coercive in nature in that sense. I look at suicide attacks. I do apply a narrow definition, which primarily assumes that the attacker will kill and die simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, that the attacker's death is necessary for the success of a suicide attack. And in that sense, most suicide attacks do involve explosions of some sort. So suicide bombings, or the other exception, would be demonstrated or illustrated by the attacks on 9/11, which of course, as Professor Schmid noted, have shaped pretty much 2 decades of our counterterrorism discussion. Can we take a look at the next slide? Yes, thank you. So I did want to start with a brief history, not because it's super useful, but there is some necessity of placing suicide bombings and suicide attacks in their contemporary perspective, and discussing the spread of suicide attacks, even while talking about the potential for preventing them. So as we understand them today, suicide bombings became popularized to some extent in Lebanon, from which they spread to other contexts, including Sri Lanka, including Israel and the Palestinian territories, and of course, other parts of the world. Al-Qaeda, which is of course best known for the most destructive and deadly suicide attack on 9/11, adopted suicide bombings prior to that day, but tended to attack harder targets, much like had been done in Lebanon. So attacking state and military targets prior to the 9/11 attack, which was, of course, involved many civilians, in addition to targeting the state in the sense of targeting the Pentagon and potentially with other objectives in mind. What's kind of ironic is that despite the interest in suicide terrorism and the interest in stopping suicide attacks, is that suicide bombings have actually spread since 9/11. They have increased in frequency, they have spread, more groups have adopted them, and they've been used in more contexts, including within the West and outside of the West. And they've done so in such large numbers that one might think, well, during this global war on terrorism, why is it that we have so much more terrorism to some extent, by some estimates and measures? Can we take a look at the next slide? So I started the question thinking, okay, are there any examples of actual prevention of suicide terrorism? And I have 2 examples, or I should say suicide attacks. And I have 2 examples that I think illustrate success in preventing suicide attacks by terrorists. One of those is the prevention of a repeat of a 9/11 style attack. And the other one is what seems to be the prevention of suicide bombings in Israel and Palestinian territories. These are 2 very different examples. One in particular focuses on preventing a specific type of attack. And this is one example that is not a suicide bombing, but rather a suicide attack in which there is explosion, but where the planes are used both as a target and as a tool of carrying out the attack, where the planes essentially become the explosive device. So this is an example of preventing a particular type of attack. The other example, the second of the 2, is an example of preventing attacks in a particular location. And in order to in my consideration of various cases that might be relevant, I considered a few others, which I elaborate more on in the chapter. I looked at the reduction of suicide bombings in Lebanon after the end of Lebanon's 15-year civil war in 1990. And there was a decline in the use of suicide bombings in that case. And I also looked at the decline in the use of suicide bombings in Sri Lanka after that country's end of civil war. But the case of Israel is different from those 2 for a couple of important reasons, which I would like to elaborate. I'll start, however, with the case of the 9/11 style attack. I do want to emphasize, though, that, again, what's kind of ironic is that in neither of these cases do we see an end to either suicide terrorism or suicide bombing, nor do we see an end to terrorism. Rather, we have seen after 9/11 and after the end of suicide bombings, for the most part in Israel and the Palestinian territories, we've seen an increase in terrorism. So terrorism hasn't ended, and in fact has in many cases increased. Can we take a look at the next slide? Thank you. So the most obvious case here, and the one that probably needs the least explanation, is the case of preventing attacks on commercial aircrafts. So pre 9/11, many of us might recall, it wasn't that long ago, it was 20 years almost, but not that long ago, you might remember what it was like to travel before we had to limit our liquids and couldn't take our big 2 liters of soft drinks onto the planes with us. Air travel was hardened, but it was hardened against things like skyjackings or hijackings and bomb threats, where the bomber wouldn't be on the plane or where the hijacker would plan on surviving the attack. Well, the 9/11 attackers, of course, took advantage of some of these vulnerabilities and did so without needing, firearms and without needing to bring with them bombs. And that was a vulnerability that was present within air travel. That certainly is one of the ways in which terrorists continue to maybe surprise us, is by finding new ways to carry out attacks or new vulnerabilities to exploit, something that's certainly relevant for several of the discussions already today. Post 9/11, of course, if many of us would really probably love to get on an airplane these days, and some of us maybe are lucky enough to get to travel during the pandemic, but air travel has definitely been further hardened, and it's much harder to do what the 9/11 attackers once did, and that is according and consistent with what Professor Schmid discussed from Kenneth Duncan's chapter, has a lot to do with cooperation and counterterrorism, having to do with how air travel is monitored and how passengers are monitored and what we're allowed to do and take with us and how we're allowed to act, etc. And there's definitely a reduced likelihood of success for any future potential 9/11 style attackers, and those who have tried have been thankfully caught. Those who've tried something besides the 9/11 style attacks, such as the underwear bomber or the shoe bomber, have been caught or haven't been very successful. Post 9/11, we've also had targeting of Al-Qaeda. And of course, that is part of what's associated with, very likely associated with some of our increasing terrorism, is the conflicts that have followed from the targeting of Al-Qaeda and the threat that they have posed. Some of the implications include adding that additional security on a foundation where security was already present. So air travel was already controlled, although you used to be able to take your pocket knife onto a plane perhaps, but now, of course, not anymore. It was already controlled. It was just a matter of adding new security to a situation or a structure or foundation that was already present. There's also some applicability to other targets. And I think that Rachel discussed this a bit, the idea of hardening targets or protecting the infrastructure, the buildings, from the potential of people who wish to do harm approaching. And that applies to air travel as well, though, as we know, airports are still somewhat more vulnerable, as we've seen since 9/11, to attackers who don't make it to the planes, nevertheless make it to the airport. We also have an overall increase in suicide bombings over time, which of course is one of the interesting takeaways and downsides. All right, thank you. The second example has to do with preventing suicide attacks in Israel and the Palestinian territories. I'll give a little bit of a background and a little bit of a discussion. This I found very interesting and just really interesting, the combination of tactics, and something perhaps worth discussing. First of all, suicide bombings were not new to Israel in 1993, but they were new within Israel. So Israel's military had been targeted by suicide bombings in Lebanon, where suicide bombings kind of got popularized to some extent. What's interesting about the beginning of suicide bombings in 1993 is the fact that it happened during the negotiations and shortly after the negotiations of the Oslo Peace Accords. So this was a time of presumably relative peace. It's the end of the First Intifada. There's a potential for increasing Palestinian autonomy and the reality of that for a period of time that was just a few years. That's also the time when suicide bombings began. The perpetrators of suicide bombings were the groups that were left out of the peace negotiations, who were opposed to the peace negotiations and who were not part of the new government, not part of the new PLO-led Palestinian Authority government. Suicide bombings increased in 2000 and peaked in 2002. These were the first years of the Second Intifada. But they began to decrease in 2003, though they remained high, and they decreased through 2004, and largely after 2005 have practically, not entirely ended, but have almost completely ended. Those are the latter years of the Second Intifada, 2003 to 2004, and it's quite interesting that the number of suicide bombings increased so much and then decreased so much also but during the conflict, not after the conflict, during the conflict. It's also interesting that the suicide bombing started at a time of peace. So I asked the question, not why did suicide bombings decrease, but under what conditions did suicide bombings decrease? So what was happening at the time that suicide bombings were decreasing? And one of the things that happened is reoccupation. So Israeli forces re-entered the parts of the West Bank they had left as part of the Oslo Peace Accords. Now, this is not involving the Gaza Strip, where Israel was not within the Gaza Strip. Israel was within the West Bank, but had left the major cities. They were Palestinian cities, and they were left primarily under Palestinian control. Israel reoccupied those cities and regained access to something that also ties in with the first chapter discussed today, gained access to human intelligence, something that Israel had enjoyed prior to leaving those major cities, but had lost to Palestinian authority, essentially. So reoccupation is part of the story, or at least is something that goes along with this reduction of suicide bombings. But there's something else that probably has much more to do with the reduction of suicide bombings. It is very much tied to the addition of human intelligence to supplement the visual and signal intelligence that Israel already had access to and maintained access to. And that was, or is, the construction of barriers. Not just the walls that we are probably pretty familiar with, but also the roadblocks and checkpoints. And how did these work in a sense to stop suicide bombings has very much to do with access to human intelligence. So the barriers allowed Israel to control the movement of people. And this is not just the people who are associated with militant activities, but rather all people to some extent are controlled in their movement. Terrorist communication was limited, their ability to coordinate was limited, their access to targets was limited, and in the process, they can be more easily surveilled and policed. People were hesitant to move through roadblocks when there's a potential for being arrested. And perhaps most importantly, something that happened with the reintroduction of Israeli service people to Palestinian cities was the access to human intelligence, which gave some insight into where there may be, or when and where there may be potential attacks, which allowed Israel to respond to those threats before they translated into actual attacks. What's quite interesting about the Israel-Palestinian case is that the Palestinian groups, the ones that had engaged in suicide bombings, didn't cease existing. They continued. And presumably they might have wanted to continue to use suicide bombings, but they were unable to, or at least they were unable to reach the targets that would be highly desirable, and they were less likely to have success, much like perhaps you could think about in the case of the 9/11 attack. There are some limitations to what I've described, and certainly some counter arguments to this assessment. For instance, if you don't mind looking at the next slide. Thank you. So there are some alternative explanations for the reduction in suicide bombings in this case in particular. And one of those might be the end of the Second Intifada. But suicide attacks began to cease during the Intifada, not at the end of it. And they had been used in peacetime by the weakest of the groups who were excluded from the Palestinian Authority governance. You might say there were changes in popular support for the use of suicide tactics by the groups representing the people's interests. And that could hold some water, except that terrorism continues. And in fact, the number of terrorist attacks has very likely increased in the form of the rockets, which still cause fear and terror. They're audible, but nevertheless are less deadly. And you could say Operation Defensive Shield, which was implemented in 2003 and was the first step in reintroducing Israel and Israeli occupation to Palestinian cities. You might say that was relatively effective, that the rounding up of militants, the identification, arrest of those militants, the taking of weapons, the destruction of weapons manufacturing facilities, that those things caused an end of suicide bombings. And maybe in the short term that was a factor, but long term, most likely not, because those capacities could be rebuilt. In terms of countering Palestinian suicide bombings, there's a very high cost to reoccupation. And of course, at the introduction to this session, ICCT said, Alexander said that this is an organization that's very interested in human rights. Well, there are consistent, very high costs of reoccupation on Palestinian communities, and there's a high cost on Israel as well. But of course, in terms of human rights, we might think of the Palestinian communities. More numerous and deadly rocket attacks, there's cost of ongoing terrorism and counterterrorism, and of course, the very potential likelihood, that there's limited applicability to other cases. Israel and the Palestinian territories being a unique case, unique geographically and in other ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne, for summarizing us your chapter, which is also intriguing. I mean, 800,000 people commit suicide every year. About 1,000 of them are suicide bombers. Recently, we've seen in Afghanistan that bombings are no longer claimed, but are used for strategic purposes, like we saw in this attack on the girls' school. We have a couple of questions, although we are almost running out of time. Maybe Alexander van der Rosenbach can monitoring the questions, or Antoinette, can you see them?
Yeah, sure, Professor Schmid, I'll take over here. And firstly, just indeed noting the time, I wanted to say thank you very much for all of you who have stuck around with us for the full 90 minutes. I think we'll let this session run a little bit longer. We'll try and get through some questions in a bit more rapid fire mode here. So apologies to the panelists. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers short and sweet. But just before you do go, if you do drop off the call here, please take a minute. You'll be prompted when you leave to do a short 3-question survey, basically just telling us how well we did here, and most importantly, whether you're learning something that's useful for your work and your efforts in the field of CT. For us, looking to make an impact, or looking to make sure that these events are relevant to our community, the answers to those from you about this event are really critical, and we take a good look at them as we shape our future agenda. So please, if you could just, when you drop off, do take a minute to answer that and help us make future events even more impactful and relevant for you. So that quick housekeeping note aside, I'm going to just jump through questions as they came in. The first question was, I think, more a methodology question for Dr. Sinai about sort of the threshold from which someone moves from a lone actor classification into being classified, I guess, not as a lone actor, therefore as a group, and how would you, where do you define that in your methodology? How do you make that decision?
Well, as you know, no definition should remain static, but should always reflect new developments in terrorism, counterterrorism. So what's interesting about the 5th historical wave, which I believe began around 2019 or 2020, is that there are all of these new trends that are affecting the way terrorism should be defined, including how lone actors should be defined. So, for example, now we're seeing the prevalence in mass protest demonstrations where lone actors are joining more organized groups. So how should the lone actors who participate in such demonstrations be defined, especially? Actually, it leads to a very interesting research question. Do any of the lone actors who participate in these mass protests then join any of the organized groups? Also, in the case of the misogynistic incels, for example, would the Proud Boys accept them into their ranks? So this would be a very interesting research question to examine. And also with the use by lone actors of online forums and their interaction with other lone actors in these forums, do they then constitute a new type of group? So what are the parameters that we should we look at in defining lone actors? Is it those who self-fund their operations, who decide on an attack without consulting anyone else, although they may be advised by others to carry out such attacks? So there are lots of very interesting research questions that now need to be examined. Actually, this would make a terrific research note in Perspectives on Terrorism. how to redefine lone actors in the fifth historical wave of terrorism.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. No, thank you for that. I do feel like that's, indeed, I remember there was a line of questions after the attack in Vienna, actually, that came to ICCT about, what does this mean for lone actor terrorism? Is it back post-COVID? And those attacks, and subsequently looking back at others, you see that indeed, although there may be individuals who are attacking by themselves, there's most often a community of support, either intentional or less intentional, underneath them to finance, to shield, to inform and guide, if not in a sort of typical Al-Qaeda type cell structure. And I do think there's quite a lot of play there around the idea that you indeed have just a self-finance, like the true lone actor, the Oslo attacks, the Breivik cases. That's, like, in my mind, perhaps the closest you have to a real sort of standalone actor who just did everything from the ground up. And there's a lot of gray area out into sort of the more group structures. And that's, I think, from a methodological point of view, indeed a challenge to decide where you need to draw the line and say, okay, well, this has moved into something that is not relevant for our data set here. So thank you for that.
And also, should you stop calling them lone wolves?
Oh yeah, I think that is there's certainly from our point of view, it's also, in addition to the points you made about sort of the cleverness and the sort of sociability, there's also a bit of a glamour component to being a lone wolf that I think we certainly at ICCT tried to discourage in our publications. And I think we see that also in a broader trend in the media that that's part of the sort of broader efforts around strategic communication and that don't say his name campaigns and things like that to de-glamorize the attackers, and part of taking the lone wolf vocabulary out of our mouths is part of that effort. So thank you for that. Is it all right if I turn now to a question for Annelies Powells? Thank you, Dr. Sinai. Interesting question about the popularity of 3D printing, of drones, of sort of technical innovation in terrorist attacks, and how that might make it more difficult to monitor or control access to these new types of technology. Do you have any advice or thoughts on how those responses should be shaped?
Yes. So I think one very important observation to start from is actually that availability and access to weapons is crucial. So that means that we need to try our best to limit availability and access to weapons, both through legal but also illegal circuits through which weapons circulate. I saw in the question also that there was this question about, well, will this then lead to terrorists or lone actors to actually go and make use of other types of weapons, such as 3D printed weapons? And I think there is obviously a possibility, but when we look at least Western Europe, we see that this is very, very exceptional cases of people that have gone to 3D printed weapons or highly technologically advanced other types like drones. But obviously there is a risk there as well, because 3D printed weapons are more difficult to detect if they're made out of plastic through, for instance, a metal detector. But I think there's also there's one case that is quite known. It's the attack that occurred in Halle in Germany, where the attacker would have printed through his 3D machine parts of the weapon that used. But I think it also kind of points us to the fact that it creates certain risks also for the perpetrator, because in that case specifically, the firearm actually jammed several times. It failed to fire. There's a lot of smoke, but not always really effectiveness. And I think that also contributed to the fact that that attack was quite limited in lethality, considering that I think he was aiming for probably a much more higher number of casualties. So I think the main focus should be on getting away people from the most deadly weapons. But obviously, terrorists are very inventive and always will adapt to what legislation is. So it's a very important point to keep updating legislation, monitor what the trends are in weapon use, and try to make sure that the loopholes in legislation are closed as much as possible.
Super, thanks for that. Yeah, I think the question around sort of the use of drones and whether indeed sort of national or EU legislation needs to come after drone technology to to try to regulate that a bit better for, a number of reasons in, harm to civilian aviation, other threats, but also, of course, the use of terrorism as those technologies get cheaper is part of this question. But I think you sort of hinted at something that I think, at least at ICCT in the corridors, or the now digital corridors, we often talk about sort of the low-hanging fruit. Of course, it is exciting or glamorous sometimes to think about using a new technology like 3D printing to provide a proof of concept. But ultimately, if you want to be impactful in a terrorist attack, it's easier to get behind the wheel of a car or pick up a knife. That is, the visual impact of those images are much more compelling in some ways than a technological success that might not ultimately get you sort of the bloodshed and therefore the psychological impact that you're seeking as an attacker. So there is I think in our minds a balance to be struck there about what is practical for an attacker and therefore practical for us as counter-terrorist practitioners to be thinking about. And indeed, your point about taking away the most deadly weapons sort of speaks to that element of it. So thanks for that answer. I wanted to ask a question actually to Professor Sinai. Again, another question about the role of women within your database. You mentioned that there was a single female attacker, and there's a question about whether we see that as the sort of the beginning of a trend, or is this sort of an anomaly and we expect therefore the vast majority of attackers to be male in the future. Did you have any I guess it's not a data-driven question, it's more of a sort of projection question, but how do you sort of interpret what you've seen over the last 30 years or 40 years?
Well, one of the limitations of our database is that it wasn't part of a funded project, so there were certain constraints on how we did our research. So there are many events that were not considered. We would just try to come up with a representative sample. And a month after I completed the research, there was an attack involving a boyfriend and girlfriend in Jersey City. And in, I think, May 2019, there was an attack by a woman in California who was an animal rights activist who carried out a shooting attack at the YouTube headquarters. And I don't know if I included her in our database. So there are examples of women engaging in terrorism. It's just that I have to expand the database to include more events, which I would be very interested to do.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that. Professor Schmid, I know you've studied this issue a little bit as well. Did you have anything you wanted to add about sort of the nature of terrorism in terms of the gender discrepancy or imbalance, as it would be?
Well, thankfully, women are much less violent than men. They're not necessarily less aggressive. We've seen women in leading roles in the Red Brigades in Italy, in the German RAF, Japanese Red Army. But by and large, these are the exceptions, and certain types of terrorism almost exclusively the main male domain. I would like to come back to one question regarding the 3D printing that has so far not produced sufficiently bad results, partly because the question of the ammunition that fits into it comes into it. But part of that question referred also to the drones, and that is an area where we can see a lot of expansion. Terrorists used to be a bomber without an aircraft, but with the drones, though their capacity to carry weight is still limited, this has changed. And we have now a database of more than 400 incidents, most of them in the Middle East, especially in Yemen. And it shows that they're not just individual drones, but whole swarm of drones can do quite a bit of damage. And this is an area where protection of public places will be increasingly difficult. We have seen assassination attempts in Venezuela, for instance. We have seen whole airports shut down for hours. So the disruption effect is quite big. Technology, unfortunately, is moving on. And the question is, who is faster in developing measures and countermeasures? So much in addition to this question.
Yeah, super. Thank you for that. I'm not exactly sure who to direct this question to, so maybe Professor Schmid, I'll send it to you first, and if any other panelists want to come in. There's a couple questions around
I lost the sound. Can anybody hear Alexander?
We've seemed to have lost Alexander van Rosenbach. So if Alex is not coming back, yes, I think Alexander is back again.
Hello, did I lose you there for a minute?
We didn't hear you.
Okay, certainly. So my question was really around what should we, I think the interesting question is, what should we expect post-pandemic from attacks? Are we expecting to see a spike in attacks once people return to the streets, to cafes, to popular places? Is that going to provide another target-rich environment? Or do we see, at least in the West, the trend downwards as part of a broader successful effort at preventing both suicide and otherwise untoward attacks?
Well, I guess that is anybody's guess. The pandemic has been instrumentalized by various parties, and all sort of speculations have been made. But one area where people will think twice is, of course, in the development of biological weapons. Soon after 9/11, only 1 month after, in fact, there was an anthrax attack, which was a biological attack, which was, as it looks now, an insider job from one of the US weapon laboratories. And of course, there is a longer history of use of biological weapons going back all the way to Japan in the 1930s and 1940s. And so as far as I can see, these weapons are highly unpredictable. In the case of Japan, only the wind had to change or so, and it blew back. So I think there's a great reticence to using such weapons because they get literally out of control. I would not dare to make any predictions about post-pandemic attacks. We see that pandemics cause casualties left and right inside terrorist organizations as well as outside. So I would think the overall effect will be probably neutral.
Mm-hmm. I think one impact that we're already seeing as a result of the preventative measures that have been implemented, we're likely to see further increase in instances of workplace violence, especially type 2, customer, patient, on employee, with certain customers who are refusing to wear facial masks or to demonstrate that they have been vaccinated. Embarking on all sorts of vengeful attacks against the employees who are asking them, to demonstrate that they've been proof of vaccination or to wear facial masks at the stores or in the workplace. So I think we are likely to see an increase in such attacks, whether they are ideologically driven terrorist attacks or psychologically driven active shooter attacks or other types of attacks. I mean, that's a separate question. That's why we need to expand our aperture. So we're not just looking at terrorist type attacks that are impacted by the pandemic, but other related violent attacks that can be as devastating, that are resulting from the pandemic and its consequences, because it's still going to take a while before everything returns to normal life.
Super. Thanks for that. I think that is a sensible observation. Maybe just one final question, then I think we'll end the session for today. Professor Schmid, you mentioned in your presentation on negotiation and kidnapping the phrase suicide ritual, and there's a question from the audience about what you mean by that, and if there is anything to look out for in hostage negotiation around that notion of a suicide ritual. Would you mind expanding on that?
Well, if negotiations take place, there's not just a negotiator, but there is a team of 3-4 others that look for cues in the language. A sort of neuro-linguistic programming takes place. And sometimes the suicide bombers uses language that indicates that he's serious about a deadline and that he's willing to kill himself or kill hostages before. And these cues can be found in the language, in the way he speaks, the speed at which he speaks, the pitch at which he speaks. There's a whole science of interpreting such things in real time. And when a suicide is imminent, which often involves also the death of hostages, then of course the government will have almost no other choice than storm the place in order to prevent the worst. So in that sense, it's almost a suicide by cop operation that has to be prevented. That is my reading of these rituals. I've seen protocols of negotiations, transcripts, and then you can clearly see that the terrorist becomes very tense and anxious and talks about things that were unusual before. So these signs can be interpreted and often lead to a premature storming of the place.
Super. Thanks for answering that. I think that covers the core questions that we have today. So thank you very much for all 80 some odd folks who have stuck on for the full session. Congratulations again to all of the panelists for all of your hard work and contributions to this event, and as well to the underlying research that powers it. Really appreciate it on behalf of ICCT. Thanks again for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week, hopefully, to talk about the back half of this important chapter, this important grouping of content in this area. So thanks very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Also, on my behalf, I would like to thank the contributors to these volumes and the 80 people who stuck up to the very end. And I hope to see you all next week. And I encourage you to read the chapters, because in 8 to 10 minutes, you cannot summarize a chapter of 30 pages adequately. So the real richness is in there. So these were only the appetizers, hopefully. Encouraging you to read it. Thank you, and see you next week.
Super. Thank you.